Thank you. The Manufacturers Association of Nigeria is a membership-based organization for all manufacturing companies in Nigeria. At the moment, we have over 3,000 members across the country in 16 branches spread all over the country and in about 10 sectors. That is different, manufacturing sectors, as it were, like pharmaceuticals, like food and beverages. Now all of us together come together to form the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria. As president, I'm the chairman of the council of the association and chairman of the executive committee of the association. There is a secretariat which is headed by a director general who is like the CEO of the secretariat. But all key decisions are taken by the executive committee and approved by council. The council meets 4 times a year to discuss and take decisions and issue directives to the secretariat. Now, the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, as I said, being an association of manufacturers, is therefore concerned with driving the interests of the manufacturing sector in Nigeria, working with the policymakers, with the government at all levels, with all other stakeholders to ensure that the interests of the manufacturing sector and by association, the economy of the country is strengthened, is enhanced at all times. So the council sits, as I said, every quarter and deliberates on a range of issues pertaining to the sector, policy issues, administrative issues, regulatory issues, all issues that affect the operations of any manufacturer.
Okay. Where do you draw the line between the labor unions and manufacturers association?
The labor unions are concerned basically with the issue of the employment contract between employers and their employees. The association is concerned with the how does the economy and economic policies and economic regulations, how do they impact the manufacturing sector? How does the manufacturing sector affect the economy? As you know, today, all economies, without exception, thrive on the strength of their level of productivity, on the strength, basically, of their manufacturing sector. Because today, what we consume as human beings everywhere in the world, ultimately, is a product of some manufacturing process. I mean, even if you take gari, it has gone through some manufacturing process. So consumption, human life today depends on manufacturing. And therefore, the strength of any economy has to do with the strength of its productive sector, the manufacturing sector.
Okay, as president of Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, Nigeria has just finally joined the African Free Trade Zone, and after a lot of talks and persuasion. What is African Free Trade Zone, and why is Nigeria being part of it?
Okay. Well, first of all, we must understand that trade itself is a natural part of economic activity, and the other part is production. You produce, because we don't produce everything we need. No individual produces everything he needs. No country produces everything it consumes. Therefore, trading takes place so that you produce what you can produce and use it to trade and buy what you cannot produce. So trading, whether it's between individuals or between nations, is a concomitant part of the economic process that exists today. So clearly, trading between nations, which of course has been going on all the time throughout history, is a major, major concern for manufacturers. Because if you produce, you must trade. If you don't produce to keep, you produce to sell. And you sometimes also have to buy in order to produce. You buy your raw materials so that you can produce your products and then sell. So trading is a major component of economic activity, just like manufacturing or production. Now, in today's environment, nations or countries are concerned with how effectively, how well they trade with other nations. And if we now come to the level of the issue we're talking about, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the essence of the matter is that African countries have done very little trading with each other. Most of our trading is done with outside countries outside Africa. And the reason is simply, well, there's a number of reasons, but the main reason is that Africa largely depends on imported manufactured products for its own consumption, and depends on export of basically raw materials like minerals and agricultural products. But to a large extent, what happens in those situations is that the value of what we import is often much higher than the value of what we export. And so we are always at some disadvantage. We export commodities, the price of which often we cannot determine. We import manufactured products that we consume, the price for which we cannot determine. And in most cases, we pay a lot more to import than we get when we export. Now, I give you a typical example. Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire is a major producer of cocoa. But they export that cocoa basically in its raw form. They export it to Europe, let's say to Switzerland. Switzerland uses the Ghanaian cocoa or Cote d'Ivoirean cocoa to make chocolate. And they now export the chocolate back to Cote d'Ivoire or to Ghana. Now, for every 1 kilo of cocoa that is converted into chocolate, Switzerland makes 95% of the value, and Ghana gets 5%. So that's a very unfair kind of trading. Now, part of the reason, of course, there may be some historical issues in the past, but African countries, as I said earlier, are generally producing agro-based raw materials or minerals that they don't themselves process and therefore have to export. So the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is actually intended to move in the other direction, for Africa to trade within itself and to be able to exchange goods within itself. Because that, as I said before, is very crucial to the growth of the economies. Also, it creates jobs. Manufacturing or processing and trading of processed manufactured goods creates jobs. Because the number of jobs that are created in the process of converting cocoa to chocolate are much, much more in terms of number and much higher quality of jobs and much more valuable than the jobs that are created in simply farming, growing the cocoa. So there are so many issues involved in this process. One, you want to create jobs, and particularly as we are aware, Africa is predominantly populated by young people. Over 60% of Africans are below 30 or 35. In fact, over 70%. And these people have to get jobs, right? And if you keep exporting your raw materials, creating jobs elsewhere, and then you have no jobs here, not enough jobs, and not the quality of jobs you require, the consequence is that you are actually exporting jobs and importing poverty. Because if you have no jobs, you're not creating value, you're creating poverty.
Why did Nigeria delay in signing this?
Yes, okay, so we now come to the issue of the signing of this agreement. You know, Nigeria was involved in the promotion of this integration, because that's the second part of the FC is actually to integrate the continent, to integrate the economies of the continent. Now, Nigeria was way ahead in terms of leading this since the 2000, I think, and 10 or something. Nigeria has been leading, pushing this process. But when the issue of signing this came on, this was March 2018, some stakeholders, including the Manufacturer Association, said, look, before we sign, let us also assess the impact and the consequences of signing on our economy, on our manufacturing sector, on our other sectors. What will be, are there risks involved to the sector? What are the opportunities that will be created? And what should we do as a nation to ensure that we can mitigate any risks that may be there and also exploit the opportunities? For instance, if we just go and sign and we have a situation where, say, our pharmaceutical sector is dominated by other people who are producing more cheaply, and therefore, since the intention of this free trade is actually to allow trading within Africa to take place as though it was one market, to remove a lot of the barriers that across to trade cross-border trade. It means that if you just go into it, it means that somebody can go to Togo and produce a product that is a major product there, and if they can do it at a cheaper rate, or if it can sell to you at a cheaper rate, it means they can actually undermine the strength of your own sector. To that extent, if they comply with the terms of the agreement. And indeed, that is what perhaps most people who sort of shy away from the agreement are worried about, whether African leaders will have the political will, because that's what it is, political will to ensure that when they sign, they stick to what they sign. They comply with the rules that they have set for themselves. So that is why the AFCFTA is actually in phases. It's not just one agreement. First of all, what has been signed now, there's a framework agreement. Framework which says we will aim to have a single market, or if you like, we'll aim to have a market where we can trade in goods and services freely. Secondly, we'll try to bring our economies together to integrate economies. Thirdly, we'll try even to organize our financial systems so that there is also some harmony in financing. Thirdly, or fourthly, we'll also create opportunities for people to move freely across the continent. So the agreement itself, this framework agreement, comprises of several sub-agreements that have to be negotiated individually. There are at least 6 major sub-agreements. The first is the agreement on trade in goods. That means whether I can import or export goods from Ghana without anybody stopping me or putting barriers to that trade. That's trade in goods. Secondly, that's trade in services. Whether I can provide financial services to somebody in Cote d'Ivoire or in Egypt, right? Or telecom services, or even consulting services. I can go and provide management consulting services to somebody in Zambia, right? So those are 2. Thirdly, there is the issue raised, that when you are trading in goods and services, there will always be a need to have rules. So the third component is to agree on the rules of the game and how those rules will be, will be imposed and will be safeguarded. So there will be dispute settlement procedures. All these constitute part of the components of the agreement. So those are the first 3. They constitute phase 1 of the AFCFTA. There is phase 2, because if we are going to engage in a continental trade, we also have to ensure that we build the capacity to produce what we are going to trade in. And that, to build the capacity, to build the manufacturing, to build means to invest. So we will have a component to negotiate on the rules and guidelines for investment flows across the continent. There will also be the issue of intellectual property, because in services in particular, even in manufacturing, sometimes you have ideas that you develop yourself, you innovate, you produce new ideas, new concepts, new products, and you want to make sure that your right, your intellectual right is safeguarded. So we'll have to negotiate intellectual property rights as well. So investment right, intellectual property right, and I think the third, which will come under the second phase, has to do with what do you call it, investment flows. Yeah. So these various components of the agreements, some are currently being finalized. That is the first phase, which is the trade in goods, trade in services, rules and procedures, as well as dispute settlement processes. These are being finalized, and it is expected that by the end of July, this first phase will be concluded. Then we go into the second phase. We now negotiate the investment flows. We now negotiate the competitive rules, because even in competition there must be rules and guidelines. So there's a protocol. These sub-agreements are called protocols. There's a protocol on investment, a protocol on competitiveness, and a protocol, as I said, on intellectual property rights. All these will have to be negotiated over time. And the whole process will involve various levels. First, at the very lower level, if you like, you have the technical people. If you like, what do you call it? The technical people who will have to work out the details. Then they report to their ministers, right? Then the committee of ministers will now finalize the negotiations, and then they will take it up to the heads of states that will meet together to endorse and approve. And of course, there will be a secretariat of the AFCFTA that will now execute, ensure that everything is, moving the way it is intended to move. So that basically is the structure of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement.
Okay, before I let you go, you mentioned protocol, and that brings me to maybe my final leg of questions. ECOWAS failed with ECOWAS Free Trade Protocol. What makes you think that this will succeed? And why did ECOWAS fail?
Thank you very much. Indeed, the ECOWAS, West African Trade, group, is called the Regional Economic Entity. It's a regional economic entity. They call them RECs, Regional Economic Community. And there are several others. The Southern African, they have one. The East African, they have one. The Central African. So there are about 8 or more of such communities that engage in similar arrangements at a regional level. And the ECOWAS is one of them, the West African Economic Community. Now, the intention is that, first of all, these arrangements will have to be finalized at the regional level and then scaled up to the continental level. Yes, ECOWAS has not done as well as it was intended to do, for the simple reason we discussed earlier, that perhaps the will to impose, to ensure compliance with all the agreements has not been there. So I think the first thing, we have to go back to that with political will. If, as a group, the 54 or 55 heads of state have agreed that they're going to do something together, and they've all signed, then the smaller group of 15 in ECOWAS will have to comply, because the others will insist that they do, and vice versa. So the expectation is that the power of the group of 54 or 55, I think the people, how many have signed? About 50, 53, 54. I think Eritrea has not signed yet. And Benin is yet to sign, although it is expected to sign. So there are 53 that have signed. Now, their decision, they must agree that it is their responsibility to make sure that their decision is implemented by their subsequent countries. And they will do so through the regional groups, the regional economic communities. So the first thing, therefore, is to align the agreements of, at the regional level with the agreements at the continental level. The second is to make sure that the regional level agreements themselves are fully complied with, so that it becomes easier for the continental level to be complied with. So that basically, you're absolutely right. The RECs, the regional economic communities, are extremely important. Some of them have been there for ages, but like I said, the issue of this willpower and the fact that there are other people from outside who are also, of course, impeded. You may be aware, for instance, that many of these economic communities also have agreements with other parties outside Africa. For instance, China, but more likely with the Europeans. There is what they call the EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement, that the European Economic Community wanted to enter into with ECOWAS. We resisted. Nigeria is not part of it, but I think some of our fellows in West Africa have signed. So these things have to be reconciled and resolved. And then one of the beauties of the Continental Free Trade Agreement is that if we are able to successfully implement the Continental Free Trade Agreement, it means instead of each small community negotiating things with others, it will now be the entire continental group that will negotiate with outsiders. And you know, there's strength in numbers. You know, it is easier to negotiate terms when you're operating as a larger group than when you're operating as a small group.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Your light went off. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Yes, sir. Wow, this is 30 minutes.
Wow. I thought it was going to be 10
I think we understood everything.
That happens, it means we will also lose jobs. And we will worsen the unemployment situation. So we said, let's study the impact and the possible consequences and assess what we need to do to ensure that we avoid any negative consequences. And also we exploited opportunities. And we need, therefore, to also ensure that we consult all the stakeholders involved in this. We consult manufacturers, we consult traders, we consult importers. Of course, we can say government and even traders in the market. Because when we do that, then we will know how best to go into this arrangement. That's what we did from around March 2018 until about the end of May, for instance. And I think it was very worthwhile, because in doing this, we have found that, yes, indeed, engaging in the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is going to create tremendous opportunities for Nigeria, for Nigerian economy, for Nigerian manufacturing. But there are certain things we have to address ourselves in order to ensure that we get these opportunities, we benefit from these opportunities. Also, there are certain things that we have to ensure when we are negotiating with other countries in the region, that we are secured, right? So these findings have helped us to be very clear about what we need to do as we go into this agreement. And that is ultimately why we just, yes, now we can sign.
What are some of those things?
Okay. First of all, we do recognize that manufacturing competitiveness depends to a large extent on the health of your basic infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, trade-related infrastructure, like ports and so on. And our infrastructure, as we all know, is rather inadequate and weak. So one of the things we have to agree, and government has to recognize, that we have to do a lot to boost our infrastructure, particularly in those areas that will impact our manufacturing. That's manufacturing-related infrastructure, trade-related infrastructure. Secondly, we also recognize that the business environment as it is does not always support effective, profitable businesses. We have so many issues regarding taxation. We have issues regarding multiple taxation. We have issues regarding, as I said, other utilities, not just electricity, but also even water and so on. So a lot of work needs to be done in this. We have talked about trade-related infrastructure like port services. As I know, for instance, our major ports are clogged most of the time, and therefore we are at a disadvantage when it comes to trading with the other countries. That's also soft infrastructure, the regulatory environment that helps manufacturers to do business effectively or competitively, the regulatory environment that helps the trading process, whether it's export regulations, import regulations, custom processes. All these regulations do impact the competitiveness of the manufacturing sector and, of course, of the economy. And therefore, we need to do a lot to ensure that these things are addressed. Okay. This is within. Even outside, when we are now going to engage other parties, there are certain things we have to be absolutely certain about. One, we do not want a situation where we say because we have a free trade area in Africa, somebody from abroad, from outside Africa can come and package things and put made in Africa and import them to Nigeria, when perhaps they're not really made in Africa. So we have to insist that if we say this is made in Africa, we have evidence. We have evidence that it is indeed predominantly made in Africa. This is called rule of origin, which means the origin of the goods that go into this product is Africa. If we can do that, then we can safeguard ourselves from the possibility of people who have perhaps matured in the manufacturing process to come and dump things like that. Also, we have to ensure that our government agencies across the continent are working in harmony. For instance, we must be able to harmonize our custom processes, our immigration processes, and so on and so forth. So that basically are some of the issues that will constitute what we will have to negotiate as we go into this arrangement.
Okay, let me quickly ask, you talked so much about the benefits and the gain, but I'm particular about Nigeria. What are the benefits for this country, considering the fact that some of the smaller African countries see us as the big brother who want to carry our pure water that we manufacture and dump on them? So, and some countries like South Africa, or Egypt, Tunisia, they have a little more advanced settings. We want to come and dump their stuff on us. So where is the benefit for Nigeria as a country?
Okay. Well, in spite of everything, Nigeria has one of the strongest, the strongest economy, the biggest economy in Africa, right? And our manufacturing sector, even though it is not that strong, it's not where we want it, is still much stronger than in many of the other countries in Africa. So actually, indeed, if this agreement comes to be, then of course, so long as some of the hurdles I have mentioned to can be removed, it means our manufacturers have an advantage because they are already there. They can rate up their production, scale up their production, and be able to export. So indeed, there is potential advantage there that our people can. Also, yes, we have a large market, almost 200 million people, but Africa as a whole is a much, much larger market, 1.2 billion people. So indeed, if I'm a manufacturer of cement, for instance, or flour, today I'm only addressing a market of 200 million. But if this agreement is successful, it means now I can address a market of 1.2 billion people. So that's a much larger market. And every person who is selling would want to sell to a larger market, right? So that's an advantage.
What we look forward to? What do we look forward to? And is it realistic? Nigeria is expecting $30 billion from this. Is it realistic?
I think it's not unrealistic. I think it could even be more. Like I said, the issue is really the extent to which you can prepare yourself, you can adjust to this larger market. The Nigerian economy is, about what? You said 30
billion.
But the African economy is about 2.1 trillion. So again, it's a much, much larger economy. So the opportunities are much bigger. And yes, indeed, even if there are hurdles, even if there are, bottlenecks, trying in attempt to access those opportunities will also create the motive, if you like, what do you call it, the motivation to push our manufacturers to do more. Also, it's not just manufacturing, also services. Again, when you have a market that's bigger and you are serving that market, for instance, our banking sector is fairly well advanced in Africa. And already, some of our banks are already providing services outside the country. In Ghana, if you go in East Africa, in Southern Africa, you see a lot of Nigerian banks providing banking financial services. Now, this is even as it is now with all the hurdles that is put before them. If those hurdles are removed through the free trade area agreement, it means that our banks can do even more. And the same thing with our insurance companies. Our telecoms is one of the strongest, and clearly telecom services is easy to scale up. And if the market is open, it means all these service providers, again, IT services, these are areas where Nigerians are doing extremely well, and I think giving them a bigger market will simply create bigger opportunities for them. Even our Nollywood.
Yes.
You see? Because that's entertainment service is a major, major economic activity today, and a major source of employment, a major source of wealth creation. So indeed, if we can open the market so that if our artists and our actors and our musicians have a 1.2 billion population to address, wow, this is a fantastic opportunity for them.
The layman will want to think that the free trade agreement is to create a zone like the Nigeria Free Trade Zone Agency regulating, you have the One Port, or you have one big land in Kano, you have one big land in Lagos where this trading will be taking place. Can you break it down for the layman?
Well, no, it's only to a little extent that it's like that. I think the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is much bigger than that. I think what we're saying is that today we are trading as different countries, with each other or even against each other. What we want to do is to open up and come and become one market, so that that market is now a single market that is trading with other markets across the world. Of course, we're not the ones. The Europeans have created such a market. But beyond just free market, there is also the potential, and this is part of the initial objective, to integrate the economies and create, therefore, a much larger, much healthier economy in the continent.
What happens to bridges now when countries breach agreements? Now, how strong will be the sanctions, and Do you think Africans are committed to keeping to sanctions, or sanctions can really work in Africa?
I think that's a very, very important question, because any agreement, whatever, whether it is between you and I or between countries, it depends on the extent which the parties to that agreement are sufficiently committed, that are in the business of financing. Like the African Development Bank, like the Afri-Exim Bank, like many other banks that are interested. I think loans will still be negotiated by individual borrowers and the people who are lending the money to them. But I think there will still be, as I told you, one of the protocols is on investment. There will still be some guidelines regarding how can Nigeria or Nigerians invest in Ghana. What safeguards will Ghana assure Nigerians who are investing in Ghana, right? And of course, if you give safeguards to the investor, you are like giving safeguards to his lender. You understand what I mean? So if, for instance, I say I want to borrow money from African Development Bank, or even from a foreign bank, to invest in the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, right? Under the AFCFTA, there will be rules that will ensure that if I, as a Nigerian, invest in DRC, right, there are certain guidelines, there are certain assurances that the AU and the DRC will give me, which will ensure that that investment is safe, which may include repatriation of whatever